Welcome to our KidLit panel tonight. My name is Valerie De Angelis. I'm a library associate here at the Southborough Public Library. We are thrilled to have four very distinguished guests with us, and I am honored to be your host for this evening. We're going to introduce the authors. They'll speak a little bit about themselves, and we've got some questions. We will then open it up to the audience for Q&A, and after that, book signing and book purchasing, okay? So I've got at the furthest end over here, Susan Lubner and Rajani LaRocca, Nandini Bajpai, and Annie Cronin Romano. And I apologize if I didn't pronounce anyone's name correctly. So, Sue, would you like to start us off?
Sure.
Okay.
Is this necessary? Is this better to have this on? So, hello everybody, and thanks for coming tonight. My name is Susan Lubner, and I actually live in Southborough, Massachusetts, but I was born and raised in Bangor, Maine, which is home of a couple of famous authors. Not me, but Stephen King and Christina Baker Klein, who went to school, the same high school as I did. She did Orphan Train. You probably know that one, and several other books. But I've lived in Southborough now for the past 25 years. And for about 24 of those years, I've been writing children's books. I'm the author of 3 picture books and 2 middle grade novels. My work has also been published in Spider Magazine and Highlights Magazine for children. Lizzie and the Good Luck Girl came out in November of 2018. And it's a story about a girl who, after experiencing tragedy in her family, looks to the universe for a sign that everything in her life will be okay. And one day, while she is out searching for a stray cat, she sneaks inside an abandoned apartment house, and she does find the cat, but she also finds a young, scared runaway hiding in this apartment house. And when she eventually notices that the girl has a 4-leaf clover drawn on her hand, she sees it as a sign of good luck and decides to bring this good luck girl into her home, believing that she can protect her family from another tragedy. And so I'm going to pass the baton to Rajani.
Is this working? Yeah, okay, great. Hi, I'm Rajani LaRocca, and I live in Concord, Massachusetts now. I was actually born in India, and then I was raised in Louisville, Kentucky, surprisingly, and then I came to this area for college and never left. And I'm actually a physician, so I am an internal medicine physician, primary care doctor, and I started writing again in about 2011, I would say, and so right now I have, this is my middle grade debut that is coming out officially this Tuesday, June 11th. But we have early copies for everyone in this room. And it's called Midsummer's Mayhem. And it is a middle grade novel, so intended for kids ages 8 to 12. And can be described as a Midsummer Night's Dream meets Cupcake Wars. So it is a book about an 11-year-old girl named Mimi who really wants to win a local baking contest to finally prove that she is not the least talented member of her big Indian American family. But then her dad, who is a food writer, comes back from a business trip unable to tell the difference between delicious food and disgusting, and kind of eating everything in sight. So she can't get any help from him, which is what she was expecting. She follows some strangely familiar music into the woods behind her house and meets a very interesting boy named Vic. And together, they visit parts of the woods that she's never seen before, and they find interesting ingredients and bake with them. And then everyone around her starts acting really funny. So she's got to figure out what's wrong with everyone and somehow win the contest. I'm also a picture book author, and I've got a bunch of picture books that are forthcoming from 2020 to 2022.
Thank you.
So I'm Nandini Bajpai, and I live now in Natick, Massachusetts, just a little, distance from here. But I grew up in New Delhi, and I've also lived in Australia, and I moved here from Australia about 20 years ago, and I've lived in Natick ever since. I write middle grade and young adult. A Match Made in Mendi is my first book to be published in the US, but I've had several books published in India, including Red Turban White Horse with Scholastic India, and Starcust, which is another young adult novel, which is a historical novel, and also Rishi and the Comic Cat, which is set in Boston and India, and it's a middle grade novel. And so just to tell you a little bit about A Match Made in Mendi, which is the new book, it'll be out in September, and it's about Simi, who's a teenager who lives in New Jersey, but she comes from a long line of Indian matchmakers, and her mother and her aunt think she has a gift to set people up, and she doesn't believe she does, but actually she does. And she comes up with a dating app using their techniques, which goes viral in her high school, and then everything just goes crazy from that point on. I'll pass the baton on to Annie.
I'm Annie Morano, Annie Cronin Romano, and I write children's picture books and middle grade novels. My first children's picture book, Before You Sleep, A Bedtime Book of Gratitude, came out in October of 2018, and Night Train came out in April of this year. I actually started out, and I'm still a speech language therapist and special ed team chairperson in education. And I was an English major in college and grew up in Framingham, Massachusetts, and now live in Hopedale, Massachusetts, which is just about half an hour from here. But I've been writing since I was 5. I've always loved writing, and my dream came true a few years ago when, after about 350 rejections, I finally got an acceptance letter. But Before You Sleep is a bedtime story that encourages children to reflect on all 5 senses, things they've experienced throughout their day before they go to sleep. And Night Train follows a train across the country, obviously overnight, and it's kind of a cinematic look at the countryside through the eyes of someone on a train. So those are my stories.
Thank you very much, all of you. So it's interesting, a couple of you at least have different professions outside of writing, and outside of Annie, the rest of you either from international locations or other parts of New England. How much of your writing reflects your real life and the experiences that you have either in your professions or from your cultural backgrounds?
You want me to start?
Sure.
What
Sure.
we're doing? Okay. So I always like to say that my stories, which are fictionalized, always are salted with grains of truth. Usually, no matter what I'm writing, I tend to write from the heart, where things that have affected me or personal experiences have sort of, they always sort of put a little bit of a stamp on whatever it is that I'm creating. Most of my settings take place in Maine. Well, I can say most of them. Both of these take place in small towns in Maine. One is fictionalized, one is actually in a fictionalized version of Bangor. I use the town Bangor. Even with my picture books, one of my picture books, it's a snowy scene and a winter scene. So definitely, in this book in particular, the main character, Lizzie, loves to adopt stray cats. She has a dog, and my family growing up, we always had stray cats and a dog. She volunteers at the animal shelter, her local one. I volunteer at my local animal. So there are definitely parts of me in my story. This story is not mine, yet I did also experience a loss like Lizzie when I was 12, and I did look to the universe for a sign that everything would be okay. So again, I take little bits of truth and then I create a completely fictionalized story from that.
Thank you.
Oh, I forgot the microphone.
Would anyone else like to add to what Sue said, or something different?
Yeah, so, is this working? Okay, sorry. Yeah, I would say that the inspiration for almost everything that I write comes from something that has happened in my life. So for Midsummer's Mayhem, actually when I thought about writing a novel, I had a memory from childhood where my dad didn't travel very often, but when he did travel, sometimes he'd be gone for up to a week. And so I was an only child with an overactive imagination, and I was like, what if the person who came back wasn't actually my dad, but someone who looked just like him? How would I know the difference? And so I had like this series of tests that I would ask him questions that only Dad would know and no imposter could possibly know. So it was always my dad, thank goodness. But so the inspiration for the very beginning of this story was the idea of what if there were a girl whose dad came back from a trip acting weird, and she was the only one who noticed, and there really was something wrong with him, but literally nobody else figured it out. But beyond that, so I'm an only child. There are 4 children in the family in this book who are loosely inspired by my 2 children, but that's still a big difference between 2 and 4 children. And then the other thing was that I loved Shakespeare when I was a kid, and A Midsummer Night's Dream in particular. I think we read it in 6th grade, and I was just obsessed with it, and I've seen it so many times, and my kids love it, and my daughter was in it when she was in 6th grade. So that was another kind of, because I thought about imaginary friends and what kind of imaginary friend might exist, and then it came to Shakespeare in A Midsummer Night's Dream and Concord Wood. So it's a fictionalized version of Concord, Massachusetts. It's comedy Massachusetts in the story.
Nice.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if this is working.
Oh, that's his room.
Yeah, it's just not turning on. But that's okay. I think I can talk loud enough. So yeah, like they said, your life experience ends up in your books one way or the other. It doesn't have to be literally something that has actually happened to you. It can even just be your worldview and the way you culturally, the way you look at the world. So yeah, I think that is definitely part of what goes into the books. But one of these books is literally something that happened to us. It is about a big fat Indian wedding that we planned for my sister-in-law, and then Hurricane Irene happened. I don't know if any of you remember Hurricane Irene. We never get hurricanes in Massachusetts, but that year, it was 2011, it actually showed up in Wellesley, Mass, the day of her wedding. And we were watching the track, and it was literally making a bullseye for Wellesley. So, Red Turban, White Horse is my sister's hurricane wedding, which is all the logistics of the story come from what actually happened to us and how we managed it. The characters are completely different, and all of that, their backstory and how everything else plays out. But the logistics of the actual wedding and how they managed everything comes from that. But I would say definitely in all my books, just the way that I think, that I've grown up thinking, that people around me view the world does come through very clearly.
Thank you very much.
I would say, I would agree with Nandini in that my books also are taken a lot from my life in terms of either inspiration, experiences I've had, or things I've done. For instance, with Before You Sleep, that was based actually on an activity I did with my students as a speech therapist, with describing how things touch, taste, feel, things like that, and it kind of morphed into a bedtime story from that activity. Night Train came from growing up, my aunt lived on a farm, and behind her farm, a train ran probably 3 or 4 times a day. And then I married someone my father-in-law is obsessed with trains and has an entire 2nd floor of his garage dedicated to everything train. And then we went on a family vacation out to the Pacific Northwest and saw the trains going along the Columbia River, and I said, I gotta write a book about trains. This just doesn't go away.
Keeps coming back.
So it keeps coming back. So definitely life does end up in your books, whether it's personal experience like a wedding or just something a theme that just keeps popping up again.
A leitmotif. Yep, wonderful. What made you write for kids, children, middle grade? What was appealing about that audience?
Annie started that.
I can start.
Okay.
Yeah. I think for me, it was because I was such an avid reader as a child that when I decided, and I always loved writing, that when I decided I was going to write, it was kind of a no-brainer that I would write for kids, because that's when I became hooked on reading, was as a child. I was from Nancy Drew to Michelle Silverstein and everything. I just read everything I could get my hands on. So I think that I've never even actually attempted to write an adult book, grown-up book. I I think it's so much fun to put yourself in that child's shoes and be a kid again. So for me, it was never even a question. That was where I got the bug, and that's the audience I love to write for.
Great.
I would agree. I was a big reader as a child, and I read a lot of British fiction because that's all that was available in India. So Enid Blyton, which nobody seems to have read in this country, but a lot of British literature. And I always felt, where are we in these stories? There were no stories about little Indian girls growing up in New Delhi, and but you kind of brush that aside. But when I had my own children and I was trying to find books for them and I was trying to read to them, nothing had changed. There was still no books about, kids that looked like them, that had their cultural background. So, be the change. And so I decided to go for it and really enjoyed, being in the heads of young people. I write mostly young adults, so I love that threshold of life, halfway between childhood and adulthood sort of space. And it's just the right place for me to write.
So I mentioned I was an only child, so books were some of my best friends growing up, and I read kind of everything. And I read books for kids. There weren't that many books for kids when I was a kid. I felt like we went from middle grade right to adult books, and we were like, fine, whatever, just read them. Sometimes every few years we would spend our summer in India, and which was great, but my cousins were all in school. So I literally had nobody to hang out with during the day, so I would go to the lending library and read everything, like completely inappropriate things. Nobody cared. They were like, fine, go ahead, little girl, just go check those out. And so I read all kinds of stuff. And then I also read Amar Chitrakathas. So they're these like comic books, basically, about Indian mythology and history. And so I learned so much from them. I loved them. And the art was all different artists. They were just really, really beautiful. And so I really enjoyed that too. And then when it came time to write, I really felt like the books that influenced me the most were the ones that I read as a kid. And I still read a lot of adult books too, but it's just a different thing because when you're still growing, it kind of settles in your heart in a way, books can settle in your heart in a way that probably can't when you're an adult. The thing that surprised me is that I always intended to only write novels, but then I took a class, like a kind of survey of children's literature, and I discovered what a picture book can do, and that it's obviously for very small children, but it's also for the adult who's reading to them, and that was very exciting, and the artwork kind of combined with the words was just a really enthralling thing to me, and so that's why I started writing picture books as well.
So I definitely think, like all of these authors, that my love for reading was sort of an impetus for my love for writing. I read a lot when I was a child as well. When my oldest daughter, who's 26, was young and I was reading to her picture books, I happened to enjoy them very much, and it kind of brought me back to a time, thinking back, well, I haven't read these in a while. It's just some of my favorites. But I was actually in a bookstore and saw a little advertisement for a children's writing workshop. And I had taken many writing courses and many writing workshops, but nothing for children. And I thought, I'm going to do this because I really like to write what I like to read, and I was really enjoying these children's books. But my shift from picture books to novels came because I had sent a picture book to an editor at HarperCollins, and she liked the picture book, but she wrote me back and said, I can really see this as a chapter book. Would you be interested in writing a chapter book? I had never done that before. And so I started reading a lot of chapter books, and I did write it as a chapter book. It never got published after all that work, but I did discover a love for writing novels. And so that's how that shift occurred. And that was quite a few years ago, and I wrote 2 chapter books, one chapter book, one middle grade novel. Neither of them got published, but finally I wrote one that did get published, so that was good. And I still like to write picture books, but my focus mainly lately has been on middle grade.
Thank you. You just touched on sort of the acceptance rejection sort of piece of writing.
Can I make one quick comment?
Yes, hi, this is Sam Stivers.
Sorry,
as a
I
selectman.
apologize sincerely. I have to leave to get to another meeting, but I appreciate you folks doing this. Very interested. I have grandchildren who are avid readers, which is very unusual in this electronic age, and a daughter who's a writer. And so I'm very interested in the writing process. I'm sorry I can't stay to hear more, but thank you for doing this.
Thank you.
Sam.
Thanks.
Yes, Sue, so this sort of dynamic of you're writing, you've been told, hey, write a chapter book, and then, oh, it's not going to get published.
Yes.
If you could talk about that experience a little bit more, maybe some others here on the panel, but also, what are the most challenging parts of writing for children, writing in general? What do you do to get beyond that, whether it's writer's block or just maybe not having a muse? If any of those
Sure.
concepts strike you.
Well, that's a lot of different things, but to answer your question about the rejection, you, as a writer, come to realize very early on that that's just part of the career. And actually, early on in your career, when you are getting those rejections, and you still get them later in your career, I'm sure being in the library, a lot of people in bookstores are very familiar with Jane Yolen, who's an iconic children's author. She posts on Facebook all the time that, you know, she sold these couple of poems, but she got this rejection. So even the likes of someone like Jane Yolen still gets rejected. So it's really just part of the business. But early on in my career, and in hindsight, I'm grateful for those rejections because they fueled my motivation to become a better writer and to really hone my skills. And sometimes you get a rejection and it isn't just because the work isn't good enough. There's a lot of other reasons why a publishing house might not take your work, which has to do with what they're publishing at the time or what they might have published that was similar already. But writer's block and those kinds of challenges, the hardest part for me, I'll just say, is writing the first draft of a novel. For me, it's just, it is so challenging to get that beginning, middle, and end that I sort of view as like the framework, the framework of a house. Once I have that, that's the part that I enjoy the most, is going in with that first draft and really working at it. That's when I will actually sit down at my desk and not get out of my seat. But that first part of writing the draft, it's a much different process. It's a lot of sitting in my seat for 20 minutes and then jumping up and going to get chocolate, or going to walk my dog, or going to meet a friend for lunch because it's just not there. And I don't know how many other authors feel like the first draft is there. It's just torture sometimes. Yeah.
Right. Some people like it.
Yeah,
I don't like it. I don't like the
Special
idea
person
that
who likes it.
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe
mean,
there are good plotters and people that maybe work with outlines and things like that, which I'm trying to start to do.
I do an outline,
You
but
do.
it's still painful. It's so painful
It is,
because
it's
you
hard.
don't really know every single thing about the story. But I guess what I would say is that we should separate, and you have already separated, we should separate the the difficulties with writing versus the difficulties with publishing, because they're two separate things. So with writing, I mean, I will tell you that, so being in medicine, there is a path that you need to take, right? You need to take these courses, and then you need to take this exam and go to medical school, and you get into medical school and you take all these courses and you do all this stuff, and then you go on to residency, and it's a path. And pretty much, if you work hard and you just kind of like learn the stuff that you're supposed to learn, you know that you're going to end up, you start at A and you end up at B. So writing for me was never like that, and I was not an English major. I was a government major in college, for whatever that was worth. But so I took some English classes, but taking an English class, even getting a degree in literature, doesn't necessarily mean that you know how to write. So I knew how to read really well, but it was a really it was a years-long process of discovering how to write, which is interesting. And so for me, the kind of analytical, scientific part of me is like, okay, this is what you do. You need to have this and this, and you outline it. But then there is a creative, right brain part of me that is like, it's magic. Like you gotta like the stuff comes and it comes in at the funniest time when you're walking the dog, when you're in the shower. So when I first started writing, I was worried that I would run out of ideas, and now I have the opposite worries that I'm like, I've got too many ideas and I need to focus on what is it that I need to do now. Now, in terms of the publishing part, I would say the hardest thing is rejection and the waiting. There's a lot of waiting. So, I mean, I don't think I've been rejected that much in my entire life. I mean, thank goodness. But eventually you get a thick skin, and although maybe not. And then
Depends who's rejecting.
Exactly, who's rejecting you and for what reason.
Yeah.
But I will say that, you know, as a reader, I know that not every book is for me. I'm not interested in every book that exists. That's okay. So that's kind of the way I have to think about it in terms of publishing. But I will tell you, I mean, I've been with my agent since November of 2017, and we've sold a ton of books. I sent him the beginning of my next middle grade. I was so nervous. I was like, oh my goodness, what if he hates it? What if he says, what the hell was I thinking, signing you? I'm like, be gone. But of course not. But it was just as nerve-wracking as it was the first time I sent him something. So it's just funny. That never goes away.
No, I agree completely. The first draft thing is, oh my god, the first draft is so hard, especially the middle of the first draft.
Oh yeah.
When there's so many possible directions you could go in. But you know, you use, I was a maths major. I worked in finance and, software. And that actually helps you with the structure of the plot and all that sort of, which is very different from the creative part of you. But it is helpful when you're looking at plotting and structure and all of that stuff that has to be taken care of and has to make sense. But it's hard. The first draft is hard, the waiting is hard, the rejection is hard, all of these things are hard. What is good is, it's a sort of creative work where you can go anywhere in your head, You can write fantasy, you can write historicals, you can write all kinds of things. There's no boundaries to what you can write. It's wherever your imagination takes you, which is amazing. So I don't know how many professions you can do that in. Yeah, it's all just in your head, you don't have to worry about anything else. And the other good part in children's writing is the community. I think children's book writers are the nicest people out there, and they support each other. You have your critique group friends, you have all these friends that you've been on this writing journey with, and
it's so true because as competitive as the business is, everybody is just so supportive and kind.
That's what I've found.
Lifts everybody up. I think because it's so hard that we all can appreciate, that we have to lift each other up and support each other.
Yeah.
And it's not a zero-sum game. Like, it's so obviously not, right? People are going to keep reading books.
Right.
We hope.
Exactly. Well,
Yeah.
That's the game plan.
Yep. Annie, would you like to add?
Yeah, no, I would agree with them. I think for me, for the writing process, the most difficult thing is probably plotting for a middle grade. I write primarily middle grade for novels. But actually for picture books, I tend to write my drafts very fast. But then there's the revisions of picture books that take forever. I'm on submission now with the book with my agent, and I think we spent a week debating over 2 words on a picture book. Like, should we use this phrase? Should we use this phrase? Back and forth, back over 2 words. Whereas in a novel, that would never really happen. You're looking at the overall. You might, depending on if it's a final line or an opening line. But so for me, with middle grade, plotting is the hardest part in that first draft. But for picture books, it's the opposite.
That's very interesting.
The draft goes out very quickly, and then it's all the nuances and the revisions that takes a long time. But I love it. It's hard, but I love it. And in terms of the publishing aspect, definitely, I think the rejections and the waiting are the hardest part.
What's a typical waiting period?
Oh, it can be
There's
There's no typical.
I got a rejection once 18 months after I sent it.
Oh.
I had forgotten I sent it. I had to go back and look. But then I've also gotten rejections after, I think 5 minutes was my
Oh my gosh.
Well, don't think about it too long.
Agent
Or don't even read it, right?
It was agents.
Those
Those were
yeah.
agents. Those weren't editors.
Yeah.
Well, you know, so my agent is one of those really fast readers and fast everythings, like rejectors, you know, requesters and all that kind of stuff.
I think
And
he may have been my record.
Oh yeah, he's pretty
Yeah.
fast. But I do appreciate that because I
Yeah.
was like, you know what? Something has to be fast.
Right.
Like I mean, in my day job, I have like if we get paged, we have to answer within 10 minutes. If we
Right.
get a phone call, we have to answer by the end of the day. We can't just let it go on forever.
Months.
Right. And
Well,
like,
I'll
oh
get back
wait,
to
were
you
you
in 3
sick?
months.
Were you
Yeah.
sick?
Yeah.
But I
I'm
think it really
sorry.
is
So I can't comprehend sometimes. I mean, I understand people's boxes are full,
Right.
and that they have, and it all involves reading, and you want them to be in a good mood and that kind of stuff. Totally. But I feel like at least one part of my life, my publishing life, is fast, and I do appreciate
Yeah,
that.
that is great.
Yeah.
Well, since we're talking a little bit about publishing, what was one result or experience you had after publication that you didn't expect?
Okay, so I'm the only one here whose book is like technically not yet out. Like it's technically going to be released on June 11th, but I had a book launch party already and had people buy my book, and we had a party afterwards, and there was a 12-year-old girl at the party who was just sitting there reading my book, and I was like, I mean, of course, we write books for children, and we hope that children read them. But I've never experienced that before. I mean, she was ignoring everything. There was all kinds of food. There was all kinds of stuff going on, and she was just like this. And her mom told me that she was 30 pages from the end when she made her go to sleep, and she finished it the next morning. And I was like, oh my goodness! And she declared it tied for her favorite books of all time. So I was like, wow, like it was so that was just, you know.
So now your bar is really high.
I know, like, oh no, how am I ever gonna top that? Exactly.
You will. You'll be lots of good moments.
That's a great moment. Thank you for sharing that.
Yes. So unexpected, well, there's so many things that are sort of unexpected, but one thing that comes to mind was, I don't know, maybe because you've been writing longer, or I don't know how long you've been writing before you got published, but I feel like anytime I publish something, it's unexpected. But particularly, I mean, I hate to say that, but it's true. It's always a wonderful surprise. With this book, I was at a point, I had published a picture book in my first, 2005, then one came out in 2006, then one came out in 2008, and then I had like this dry period where I was looking for jobs I gotta do something different, I gotta go find another job, because I was doing this full time, and I was thinking that I should have been a dentist. I don't know, I should have done something different with my life. I am never,
Grinding
ever,
teeth
ever.
must be better.
Not that there's anything wrong with being a dentist. I mean, that's a great job. But I was just thinking I should do something different. So I went to SCBWI, which is the Society for Children's Book Writers and Illustrators. They have a big conference. They have a New England conference, but this was one of the national conferences in New York. And I can't even remember her name. Her last name is Sarah Czar.
Sarah Czar,
She
yes.
spoke, and she was speaking like she had been in my brain. I started volunteering for literacy, blah, blah, blah. I'm like, I did that. She was describing like everything that was going at one point wrong, and she did all the things that I was looking online for jobs, and I was doing that. So right after that conference, I went home and I just decided I'm going to go through all my old stories, and I was looking through my emails, and I came across this random email that one of my critique partners, who's a professor of English at Wellesley, one of her students had gotten a job as like an associate, this is several years ago, of course, an associate editor at a publishing house. And she said, tell your writers group, because it was her professor, they can send me something, anything they want. And I had like lost that email. Somehow I magically found this email. It was like a sign. But I sent her in this story, and within a month, and I had, by the way, had an agent that couldn't sell the story that I was asked to write as a chapter book. So we had just parted ways. So now I had no agent and no thought of ever selling anything again. And I find this email and the unexpected surprise of just getting, in 30 days after that conference, an offer for this book. Right in the email. We love this book and we want to buy it. And so that was probably one of the biggest unexpected surprises, and it was also sort of a turning point that, see, you don't give up on your passion. And that was a long story.
That's a great story.
But that was true.
I think for me, the biggest, having 2 books come out in a year, the biggest surprise, and it shouldn't have been a surprise because people told me, but was that the work begins after your book comes out. And I never really thought about that, but it's like to try to keep it forward in people's minds and keep promoting it and all
Marketing.
that. Yeah, marketing. I knew it would be a lot of work, but I didn't have any idea how much work.
So you're birthing the book and then rebirthing it.
Yeah, it's kind of like it's a whole different process. And I was definitely an English major, not a marketing major, so I'm learning as I go. But people told me, but for some reason, I don't know, you think it's going to go out there and just here everyone, take my book, love my book. And you really got to work at it, but.
So, you know, for me as well, it's the reader feedback, and 3 of my books have come out in India, and they don't have Goodreads and all this other stuff to really get feedback, you know, the regular way. But a lot of kids have written to me, and that is just the best thing. They'll find you online, and they won't write a public review, but they'll send you letters, you know, telling you how much they love the book. And recently I've had a bunch of emails from kids who read this book, who read a couple of my books a few years ago when they first came out, and now they're going off to college and they're cleaning out their rooms and they found the book and they've read it again, and they've said, you know, I loved it just as much and it's going to college with me.
Aww.
So, you know, which is amazing, you know, to see that they've read it multiple times and they're taking it along, and that's the only one they're taking. That's just amazing.
Yeah, it's got to be wonderful to get that feedback.
Yes,
You don't know how
yes.
many lives you've touched,
Exactly.
in what ways, and you know, to think that that's the ripple that you've started, that's got to be very gratifying. At this point, unless there's anything else you'd like to add to this conversation, I was going to open it up to our audience for any Q&A.
I was just going to say one
Yes.
more thing, because this is a panel about writing for children.
Mhm.
And one of the most important lessons that I've learned as a writer, it sounds so crazy and simple, but I've learned to give myself permission to write badly, because that was my biggest problem with getting that first draft down, because I would sit there and start and say, oh my gosh, no, that's horrible, and get up and walk away. But to allow yourself and know that that first draft is not going to be perfect, and it might be even awful, but just allow yourself to just write it and get it out there is very freeing creatively. So that's all I wanted to add.
Actually, I'm going to renege on my offer on the Q&A just for a second. I have a question. So you've all got children. I have one son, and you know, sometimes when I ask for his feedback on things, I never know what I'm going to get. Do you ask your children to participate at all, either formally or informally, in your process?
Occasionally. Yeah, not so much now. I did just write a picture book that I shared with one of my daughters, and she gave me great feedback for it. But honestly, when they were they're older now, but when I was writing a lot of this stuff, they would always be so proud, and you know, when I published something, but they weren't that interested, to be honest with you, in providing feedback. I don't have time right now. I'm sure it's good, Mom, but I can't read that right now. So, not my kids. Sorry to say. Sorry, kids, if you're watching, you weren't that helpful. My husband was pretty helpful at times, but my kids were too busy.
So, yeah, I think both of my kids read this novel in various stages. Sometimes I would actually, my daughter is really great for talking through plot points, where I would just say, and then this happens and that happens, and she'd be like, why, like, that doesn't make any sense to me, and I'd be like, oh, okay, then I need to figure out whether it really doesn't make any sense or whether something needs to change. The novel that I'm working on next involves baseball and math, and my son is really good at both of them. So I was like, okay, you gotta like double check my like, are these terms correct? And he was very helpful for that. And then if I really, really, really want somebody to just criticize me in the sweetest but also the harshest way possible, it's my husband. My husband is just like, okay, this sentence is awful, or like whatever. So I have to like be prepared. It has to be like an advanced version of the story that I send to him. But he's really helpful in that way. The picture books, I don't think they read as much. I think I just feel like I have. I mean, first of all, I feel like they're shorter, so I can kind of revise a lot, and it's more the novels that they read for me.
Yeah, I didn't grow up in this country, so one of the ways the kids help me is to figure out if I have the language down, if it's American enough sometimes, because, sometimes my British English will come through, or my Indian English will come through, and, I'm like, how do you say this? And they'll help me with that. But, I talk to them nonstop about everything. So, and you get the feedback, whether they like it or not, they're going to hear about all my plot problems, and, and they will tell me exactly what they think. So, and I do have 3 sisters, and one of my sisters is a very well-published writer, so she reads all my drafts. I have another sister who's really good at keeping me on task. When I'm trying to get through a first draft, she will be like, I'm waiting on Saturday morning in Australia for you to send me the next chapter. So it, sometimes she'll call me and say, where's the next chapter? I'm like, I haven't written it yet. Go and write it now. So, they keep you going. And my third sister is really, really supportive. She's amazing. So I'm lucky. The husband is no use. He's not a reader. He's very supportive in other ways.
Understood. Yes.
You just needed to add that.
Yes, TV. That's right.
I have 3 kids, and when they were younger, sometimes I would read them my picture book drafts, not for feedback so much as because you're always told to read your work out loud and see how it flows. So it felt more natural to read it to somebody than to like read to the wall or to the dog. Although the dog is an excellent listener, likes everything I write. But
Smart dog.
But so that I would read aloud for that, but not so much to get feedback. But now my kids are older, and my oldest is actually going to college in September for creative writing and publishing. So she's much more interested now in reading critically than when she was younger. And she was involved in a lot of critique groups, so now I think she has much more of an appreciation of what kind of feedback to give. So she did actually tell me that she's going to miss reading some of my things when she goes. And I said, don't worry, I'll just have
you
it
could
to
just
you.
say.
The beauty of the computer. But no, it was more just to hear it, the picture books, to hear it read out loud. Hear the flow and the cadence.
So I have one thing to add to this,
Please.
is that my daughter actually likes to write, and through middle school, in high school she's kind of too busy, but like in middle school she did a lot of writing, and she did a lot of kind of collaborative writing with other people on Google Docs, and she used to make me laugh because she'd be like, we've got this great idea, this is happening, there are these worlds, blah, 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 and like, they would alternate chapters, and then I'd be like, what happened to that story? She goes, it got really boring. And she's like, so we just stopped, and we're starting a new one, and it's gonna be blah, blah, blah. So I would say, and I said to her, I said, I totally understand how you feel, but that's the difference between, like, finishing the story is the first step to all of this.
Right.
So even when it's super hard and it seems really boring, to just keep going.
We call that the saggy middle, I think, right?
Yeah.
Because as it gets, you keep writing, and then it's like, where's this
Yeah, it
going?
kind of
It
drops.
just sort of drops.
A long baseball season, right? Just
We just heading for the All-Star game. Come on.
And I will say my daughter, when I was writing Starkest, which was my first book to be agented and go out on submission in this country, she was so supportive because, the rejections, you get the rejections, and I was really sad. And she would draw these cards and say, Mom, your book will get published. Aww. And it was so sweet. Now I look back at that time and I see how much, we support them, but they also support us, and
Absolutely, absolutely.
Okay, you must be all wonderful role models, you know, for your children to see you balancing so many different things, and the stick-to-itiveness, persevering. I mean, these are all lessons that we always want our kids to know and to own, but to see their mothers doing this, that's got to be one of the greatest life lessons they've passed on.
I think for this career, a good lesson is because it takes so much, perseverance to just get published, that you just don't give up on something that you're passionate about, and that's a good lesson, no matter what you do in life, to just keep at it if it's important to you, and if you're passionate about it.
Right, well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
I have a question.
Please.
That's good to follow this, actually. One of the questions, I know Nandini's sister is a writer, but do any of you have parents or aunts and uncles, grandparents who were writers that were that kind of a role model for you? Because it seems like such a unique passion and takes so many different skills or unique skills that you don't see in everyday jobs,
Well, I have creative people in my family. My sister's an artist. She's an art teacher. She's actually just retired this year after teaching in school. And my brother doesn't do this for work. He's a stockbroker by trade, but he sings and he plays, and he's musical. And I will say that Marjorie Charmette, who did the Great the Nate series, she's actually a relative of mine. And so, well, she's just passed away recently. And my aunt was always writing. She was not a published author, but she was always writing stories. So there is in my family, there's like a creative thread. I will say that.
My grandmother wasn't a writer per se, but I shouldn't say that. She was a writer. She wrote down a lot of things, but she was an amazing storyteller. And she would have all the 10 grandkids around her telling stories.
Oh, nice.
And we would just be enthralled by her stories. So I think, that's really was inspiring to me. And then we actually do have a couple of poems that she did write that we have tucked away. But just that oral tradition of storytelling came from her. So I think that kind of planted the seed a little bit.
Great question.
There's no one in my family who's a writer, but my dad liked to act when he was young, and so did I. And but there was a lot of storytelling in my family too. And my mom was super creative in the kitchen. Like she never ate meat, and she would like reproduce these meals that had meat in them for us, having never tasted them. And I was like, I don't even know how you did, like without a recipe. I don't know. She just made up this stuff. So I think, and food plays a role in every single thing that I write. So I think that's part of the creativity in the kitchen translates into creativity in writing.
So my sister's the writer, but both of us were inspired by our dad. He was a career army officer, but he wrote like middles for the Times of India and things like that. And then after he retired, he got a master's in journalism at the University of Queensland in Australia.
Oh my goodness.
When he was in his 70s.
Wow.
Yeah, so he's the one who had the library, who had all the books, and would write plays and things like that. And so we get it from him.
I have another question.
Please, keep them coming.
Would you like to? So the picture books you write the picture books, but how do you deal with the artwork? I'm assuming you're not the artists too for the picture books. How does that work, connecting up with artists? Do you find your own artists, or is that done through the publisher? Or
It's done primarily through the publisher. These two books came out with a smaller publisher, Page Street Publishing, and that was a wonderful experience because they actually sent me 5 portfolios to look at, and I got to have a say in who the artist was. That's not a typical experience,
Really?
though. I have several friends. I don't know about your experience, but I know I have a couple friends that have books coming out with some of the larger publishing houses, and they didn't have any say in who the illustrator was.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I think it depends on the size of the publishing house.
So, yeah, I would say that I'm with middle to small size publishers for my picture books, and they've been lovely.
Yeah.
So for the first one that we sold, but like is going to be the last one published, is with Candlewick, and they gave
Yeah.
me
And they gave you-
they gave me choices, and if I
Right,
didn't like
right.
any of them,
Yeah,
we
that's
could
how
go
I
back
had
to the
it.
drawing board. And then ironically, I'm going to have the same illustrator with 2 different publishers for 2 different books that are completely unrelated. But
Oh, wow.
but both the editors were like, "What do you think of this person's art?" And I was like, "Absolutely." And this
Yeah.
person has a very wide range of art,
Yeah.
so it was a perfect match. But I also wondered about that. So I think what's interesting with picture book writing to me is that you know, people ask me, have you figured out all the, you know, the images that are going to go with this? And no, I don't. I'm not married to a specific kind of image. When I write a story, I do try and break it up into scenes that would make sense for a page turn. But I'm not enough of a visual person to say this is the way it should be. So we're just getting very, very preliminary sketches for the
Yeah.
first picture book so far. So that's exciting, and there's some kind of details that you can comment on. But other than that, I mean, these are amazingly creative creators, really, you know, artists and creators, and so they bring their own kind of twist to things, which is really exciting.
Yeah, I worked with Abrams for my picture books, and they were pretty inclusive. They did ask me who I imagined illustrating specifically my second picture book, and I wrote back a name that she said, that's who we were gonna pick, but he's busy for the next 5 years. And it was funny though that we had the same in mind. So we ended up using the illustrator of my first picture book, and then another picture book that I did was they were inclusive. They always said this is what we're thinking of going with, and so on and so forth. And I always was able to see the sketches for the book as well. But I always like to sort of use this analogy when I'm at schools, and people always ask that question, how do you choose your illustrator? And I always say, I don't choose my illustrator. The publishing house is a little bit like when you're making a movie. You have like a producer that's in charge of the whole putting together of the film, and they sort of choose, you know, the director, they hire the actors, and you know, the set designers, and everybody has a specific job, unless you yourself are a writer and an illustrator, of course. But everybody has their own expertise, and the publisher and or the editor or the art director, in the case of illustrating a picture book, oversees that. And they're really the ones that have, you know, the vision to be able to figure out what's the best way for the book to be designed and illustrated. But page turn definitely is something, as a writer of picture books, you have to keep in mind, you know, that there is a marriage between the text and the illustrations. And so you do have to think in terms of, when you're writing your text, is the illustrator going to be able to create something new and exciting with each page turn? And is it going to move the story forward? Because there is that relationship. But as far as figuring out what style the art is going to be, I know what I like when I look at it, but I don't actually visualize that when I'm writing it necessarily.
And I will say that even though your question was about picture books, the same thing happens with novels, with
the covers.
With covers,
Oh,
and I
yeah.
have interior illustrations in here, which I didn't know was going to happen until my editor sent me a bunch of sketches, and I literally I was in a parking lot looking at my iPhone, and I was sobbing because it was so wonderful, and I was like, an artist read my book and made art from it, and I just couldn't believe it. So it's spectacular. I mean, that is one of the surprises and joys of this whole
The way
process.
did you guys have a say in your cover art for your
A little bit,
Yeah.
yeah.
Oh, cool.
Yeah. They sent us, they sent me to 2 different artists and said, these are the 2 artists. And I said, oh, I love them both, but I love this one. So.
Well, and this one, my dog is actually on the cover. I sent a whole bunch of pictures
Oh, that's
of
so
my dog
cute.
to the illustrator who did the cover, and it looks like Yogi. It actually looks like him.
sweet.
And my one picture book came out with Pratham, which is they're a really good non-profit publisher in India. And it was amazing just to see how they took the text and they just breathed life into it. And I only got to see the black and white layouts after, after the illustrator had worked on it. But it was just amazing. And they ended up animating it and putting it out in, 5 different languages.
Wow.
So it was moving and everything. The illustrations were actually, animated. So it was amazing. It was a great experience.
Any other questions?
I
I have one last one, just for fun. Anything that's indispensable to you when it comes to writing?
Coffee.
Coffee.
No. Coffee and chocolate.
Coffee and chocolate.
No, that's
Great duo.
I've got to come up with a better answer than that. You guys. go.
I would say my critique partners.
Yeah.
I just can't even. There is something. So I think what's really lovely, one of the loveliest parts of this whole thing is that when you have friends who are also writers, which is great, but the critique partners are like the aunties and godmothers of your books. And I say this because all my critique partners are women, but like I'm sure uncles and godfathers could also be true. But my critique partners have read so many versions of so many of these chapters that it's hilarious. And one of them read the final book recently, and she goes, "Oh, it's different from like what I remember," because obviously I went off and did revisions with my agent, with my editor, and so she's like, it was so much fun to come back to this, and she's like, and the heart of that story was there from the beginning, and I was like, well, so but I don't know what I do without them. Sometimes I call them up when random things happen, and I'm like, what do you think about this? And they can give me perspective, so it's helpful.
I would say staring at a wall time, just having mental headspace to process things. Without that, I can't make stuff up. You just need that time to daydream. Just have time to make stuff up in your head.
Right.
Yes.
And for me, my I have a dog and 2 cats, and somehow it's really helpful to have them around. A lot of things come to you when you're sort of walking in the woods with the dog, or
Yes.
just
Absolutely.
laying on the couch with the cats and staring at a wall. That helps. I don't know why, but it helps.
So I had a creative writing teacher in high school
Yeah.
who said to our class, he said, poets need time to stare out of windows. And I was like, I don't know what you're talking about at that point, but
Yeah.
now I totally get
Yeah.
it. And
Yeah.
that quote actually made it into this book.
Oh, really?
And I went home for my high school reunion, and he was the first person I saw, and I said, something you said is in this book. And he was like, I hope it was something good. But it's so
Wasn't
true.
he excited?
Exactly.
Yeah, he was.
I need that.
Yeah, but it's in this day
Everyone does.
with like the phones and the
Oh, yeah.
I mean,
constant-
it's hard.
Yeah.
It's hard to put that away, but the dog helps for sure.
The dog definitely.
Yeah, I would say the quiet, the solitude is,
Yeah.
if I'm gonna write, I have to have my phone away and off and turn the house phone on. Do people still have house phones? We still have a house phone.
I do too.
Just having that, it doesn't have to be silent, but I just free of distraction.
Yes.
So.
I'm going to say writer's group for coffee is a serious issue. I was really serious.
It is.
I mean, I
Absolutely.
can't write without my coffee. But a writer's group, definitely. There's also the space, it kind of goes to that staring out the window or staring at a blank wall. I do this thing, I call it my pickling process when I go to schools. And it's when you take your manuscript or whatever it is that what you're working on, whether it's finished or not, and you sort of just set it aside. Either stick it in a drawer if you've printed it out, or just walk away from your computer or close your notebook, whatever it is, and don't look at it and don't read it for a week or a month or whatever it takes until you're ready to go back to it. And when you go back to it and you read it, you're like, oh my goodness, this has to be totally different.
Yeah.
And that's a huge part of the revision process too. So that's very important, that space between what you've actually written and then rereading it. And I call it pickling because it's like when you make pickles, you start with cucumbers.
We call it simmering.
Set it aside,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Food and
Simmering, that's a good one.
My other indispensable thing, she mentioned her writing group, is definitely my writing group. And it's not, I have a critique group, but I also have a writing group. And my writing group and I get together once a month without fail. We're actually getting together tomorrow morning. And we don't critique each other's work, although a couple of us are also critique partners, but we just talk about what our writing goals are. We have to come with them written down. What did we do over the past month? What did we achieve? What did we not achieve that month? What are we hoping to achieve over the next month? Where are we getting stuck with our writing? And it truly is almost like a support counseling group, because it can be a very solitary profession when you're sitting there at your desk trying to be alone and focus and everything. So we have a lot of laughs, but we keep each other on track. You know, kind of gives you that accountability. For when I go next month, I have to be able to say I finished this draft, or I did this chapter, or I proofread this, and so it's a nice group of people to have to kind of keep that accountability up. And I don't think I would be nearly as productive without them. They're kind of bossy, but they keep me.
The boss is good.
They keep bossy.
It's funny,
They
I'm
keep me in line.
not currently in any critique group, but I've had 2 in the past that have been amazing, and they're still there for me. You know, I kind of drop in once in a while. They move further away from where I am, so you know, it's hard to get to, but it's so helpful.
Yeah, it really is.
All right. And maybe as we approach summer here, any tips for kids for summer reading? To get kids interested in doing summer reading, those who might be reluctant readers?
I would say anything they have a high interest in, even if it means that you have to read it to them. I think a lot of parents, once they hit an age when they're actually reading on their own, stop reading to their kids. And sometimes they start to lose interest, and I think if they can get lost in the story, even if they're not reading the story themselves, that can keep them,
It's
pull
another
them
form
back
of
in.
literacy.
So yeah, so finding something that's of high interest, whether it's something they can read on their own or something you might have to sit down and read with them, helps a lot.
Maybe starting a reading log. You know, sometimes kids need a goal, you know. So if you have a reading log or a reading challenge, sometimes people have, you know, libraries have reading
Absolutely,
challenges.
yep.
Would say, you know, you can read a book about, you know, somebody who lives in a different part of a country than you, or in a different country altogether, or, you know, whatever. And just to have a goal.
So I would say 2 things. One is for adults to model being readers, because I think that's kind of one reason why my kids love to read, is that they would always find us with books. And the other thing is to just, especially since it's the summer, is to read whatever you want to read.
Yeah.
And
That's true.
don't restrict
say,
kids
yeah.
and say that's not like
Right.
hard enough, or that
Right.
it's
Yeah.
just silly. Silly is good.
Yeah.
I think that was one of. I mean, I think that growing up at the time when I did, where we had a lot more just freedom to just randomly do things, and nobody was paying that much attention to
Right,
us.
that's true.
We just read whatever we wanted to read, and
Right.
nobody
Didn't have
criticized me.
technology, though.
Right. So pretty much they were like, okay, just go enjoy yourself, and so we did. And but that meant that because I loved what I was reading, I would just read more, and I'd be more willing to take risks because I knew that no one would tell me don't read that.
Right. I'm just going to add one thing on top of that, and that is read whatever you want, but that means even if it's a comic book or a magazine or something that isn't traditionally what you want your child to read, these kinds of books. If they want to read comic books, or, you know, I think of graphic novels as sort of similar to the comic books that we used to read. Anyway, so reading anything, you know, or whatever, magazine, anything, just encourage the reading. Whatever it is. I used to read Archie comic books when I was growing up. I loved them.
Me too.
No, we have
I learned about solar.
What's that?
Riverdale.
Yes.
The show.
I
yeah.
don't watch it.
Yeah,
I
that's a
probably
little-
should.
okay.
It's dark, isn't
Yes.
it?
I think it's fun.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'll have to listen. I have to add it.
I
to
read
the
why.
list.
It's not your old
Everything else I
Archie,
read.
that's for sure.
Oh,
It's not
understand.
Archie
But
and
I learned
Chuck.
about solar eclipses from a Dennis the Menace comic book. I will never forget that. I was like, look at that. I don't know why he was learning about solar
So
eclipses.
even the Amar Chitra Kathas. Those
lots
are
of
amazing.
lots of important information in there. Absolutely.
Great. Well, you are all just a delight. This has been fantastic. Thank you very, very much for coming. Thank you for your questions. Thank you again, and we hope you can come back and visit again, and we look forward to all of your publications in the future.
Thank you.
Thank
very
you.
much.
Thank you.